At MagicCon Minneapolis, I had so many amazing interactions and conversations with so many different types of people. But one of the conversations that really continues to stick out in my mind is something that I had with a now new friend of mine, Princess Weeks. I remember it very clear. We were sitting waiting for the Good Luck High Five panel to start, and we were talking about how there were so many amazing characters in Magic the Gathering that so many people don't know about. Specifically at this point we were talking about black characters because people like know Teferi and like now people kind of know Kaya, but like there's so many other amazing black characters that people don't know about. And I had kind of thought about that, but like talking to Princess, I really kind of started sitting there and digesting the fact that yeah, that's true. There are so many black characters that people don't know in Magic because while we're focusing on lore to an extent, and Vorthos people like myself know a lot of characters, that's because I'm already in the game. I'm in it. I love it. But that's not a typical thing, and it's not something that the game kind of pushes forward. We should be putting these characters to the forefront. So that conversation was truly a standout for me that weekend. And also, if you don't follow Princess Weeks, you absolutely should check her out. She's amazing. Has great thoughts on so many different social things and also just like fandom things and film theory. It's amazing. Follow her. She's great. But that conversation had me thinking about how I could make some small impact on that and help people see the amazing swath of characters in Magic the Gathering, which then prompted this. Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to my channel. My name is Stalwart Ursa. I talk about delightful, geeky things that kind of cross my mind. I realize as I've started doing TikTok and Twitter and streaming and now YouTube that I have had a very long and kind of sorted background with the various geeky things that I'm interested in fandom. So I kind of thought, why not use all of those abilities that I have and all of that experience that I have while also being a lesbian woman to take all of that and channel it. So today, folks, we are taking a type of inspiration from that conversation that I had back in Minneapolis with Princess Weeks. And now I'm bringing you this. It's Pride Month. We are here, we are queer, and we play a lot of very nerdy things. So I am talking to you today about queer characters in Magic the Gathering. Being that this is kind of like a proof of concept pilot episode, I guess, of this miniseries that I'm doing of the queer characters in Magic the Gathering, I sat for a few minutes and really thought about like, because I'm going to be talking about the characters and then I'm also going to be talking about like couples, because there are a few couples in Magic the Gathering and there's a few couples that are queer in Magic the Gathering. And I really thought, who can I do this intro episode about? And I thought about that for all of like 5 minutes. And then of course these two came up in my head, and how could I not talk about them first? They're the ones that kind of at this point in Magic history are the ones that kind of come to mind because so many things have been done with them. They were very integral to the current storyline, and they have a bit of a weird past based on how they were written previously. Of course, if you played Magic the Gathering, you know who I'm talking about. Today we're going into the general brief overview of Nissa, Revane, and Chandra, Nalaar. So like I said, this is kind of going to be a broad strokes general overview of these characters and their queerness as it pertains to them being characters and their influences in Magic the Gathering. I will, however, have to state this up front. I am going to be working with their revised Origins storyline. What do I mean by that? So if you aren't a big fan of Magic the Gathering, I've realistically only been playing for just about 6-ish years now, so I'm not the oldest Magic player, but there are, much like comic book canon, and this is actually another thing that I'm probably going to make a video about at some point, but just like comic book canon, and specifically DC pops into mind lately because they just keep freaking doing it. DC every 10 or so years just kind of like Etch-a-Sketch shakes the universe and is like, okay, here's the same characters that you know, but here's a completely different backstory. Here's a different origin. Here's a different beginning litmus of why they're heroes. So the Origins revised version of the Magic the Gathering characters is kind of that. Since Magic has really only been around for now 30-ish years, this is technically the second generation of someone's origin, so I'm going to be working with that for Nissa and Chandra. It's just a little easier, and then, as is generally the case when you do multiple points of origins, their first origins were kind of trademarks of their time and the style of writing of those time periods. So I'm just not gonna talk about those. And also, they're not really pertinent to current meta and current story canon. So I'm not gonna bring those up. There are a lot of people who continue to hinder and like hang their hats on the fact that X, Y, and Z happened in their original origins. They did. They're not currently canon anymore, so I'm not gonna talk about those. Chandra Nalaar was born on the delightful plain of Kaladesh. Kaladesh is very Indian inspired, with a lot of like alchemy type of things going on. A lot of building, a lot of tinkering, a lot of people who have a lot of very big mindsets and a lot of different types of magic. But when she was born, fire magic wasn't very popular. It was something that people didn't think was something that could be properly controlled. Also around this time, the Aetherborn, which were a type of people who are actually born of pure energy, weren't being treated the best. So Chandra grew up with her parents, Pia and Kiran Nalaar, doing kind of like the Aetherborn Underground Railroad. They were helping Aetherborn travel all around Kaladesh because people weren't necessarily treating the Aetherborn as beings with rights and feelings because they were just pure energy. So that was not the greatest time for Kaladesh. But Chandra growing up with her parents kind of doing what was right, or what they believed was right, which truly what was right, and saw them doing that and unabashedly doing that to the best of their abilities, kind of helped Chandra very much grow a big sense of justice. And she herself very much had her own broad, very brash way of getting things done. And she had this huge stake of what is just should be done, no matter what. And then the moment that Chandra became into her own, she started having an affinity for magic. And then, of course, had the affinity for fire. Her brash and very forward emotions and being very passionate in general made her prime for fire magic. And that became a lot. And in that, she eventually sparked and became a planeswalker. Sparking is effectively what makes a planeswalker a planeswalker. Everyone has a form of energy and magic energy within them, but planeswalkers spark for whatever reason and are able to take that energy and move from a plane to another plane to another plane to another plane. Eventually, planeswalkers could learn to control that, but typically when planeswalkers initially spark, they kind of just take off and go somewhere else. And that happened to our dear old Chandra. Now, as fiery as ever and as like headstrong as ever with the thought process that what is right should be done, no matter what. And she took off into the greater multiverse. Nissa Revane, on the other hand, also an only child, was born on the wild plain of Zendikar. Zendikar is like if jungles could have giant kaiju and a huge sense of the natural life being a big influence on everything. And Nissa was born as the second animist. An animist is a type of magic user who is very, very, very akin and attuned to the feelings of nature around them. They're able to listen to the energy of the nature and then also kind of pull from it to be able to assist and manipulate nature. And that's pretty great. Her mother was what was previously known as the last animist, and then Nissa came along and then started showing the affinity for it, and so Nissa became the second and now the last animist. She kind of very much grew because of her tie and her animist powers to nature as a little more reserved, but not in the way of she was quiet and soft spoken, just in the way of she was more willing to observe something and then bluntly state the fact of what it is, because she took the time to sit there and observe and listen due to what she was raised and how she had her own nature of being an animist. So she is not afraid to sit down and tell you what she thinks based on what she has observed of a situation. And that tends to get her in a little bit of trouble, mostly because people tend to feel that she is unfeeling and not emotional. But the fact of the matter is, she's just watching a situation and observing it and using everything that has kept her alive at this point, because, again, Zendikar is a wild, wild place. And that is what she uses to get around in her life. And being an elf, she's going to be relatively long-lived, as long as nothing kills her. And then, with her animist powers, she is able to spark and go to different planes. And through her sparking and going to different planes, and also Chandra sparking and going to different planes, they eventually meet up with other planeswalkers. Jace, Gideon, and Liliana. And in their adventures of meeting each other and getting to know each other, they eventually form the Gatewatch. Literally, almost like a mini Justice League of planeswalkers who understand that there is a greater multiverse, that there are greater stakes than if one thing happens on one multiverse that could shift the balance of energy and everything across the greater multiverse. And so they came together to try and kind of figure things out to help different planes however they can when a situation arises. And at this point, the Gatewatch, they were literally watching a specific gate. It was very literal when they named themselves, you see. They were watching a very specific gate because some very bad things could go down if that gate ends up being breached. So that was the initial litmus of all of them being together and working together. There were numerous times as this was happening, magic was not necessarily, it's not that they weren't story focused, but like it was very, here's the story to play the cards. So a lot of things kind of broadly stroked happened. So it wasn't always pieces being put together. Nevertheless, though, we did start seeing the characters having great moments of interaction. We saw Chandra having a relationship with Liliana. Liliana being far older than she actually appears due to her necromancy and various things that she did in her life. We saw Chandra having a great relationship with Liliana, where they almost have like an older sibling, younger sibling type of a relationship. We see Nissa kind of bonding with Jace a little bit because they both don't necessarily know how to like engage with individuals in the typical societal okay type of way. So we see that happening. And then we also see that Chandra and Nissa really start kind of almost, in how lack of a better word, circling each other, because they are both so vastly different from each other. Chandra being so hot-headed and brash and ready to just go and fuel her emotions and go with the feelings that she has, and Nissa being more willing to sit back and observe something and then bluntly state fact. That kind of got them both in situations where they thought that the other was being too slow or being too fast. And then eventually through that, they start realizing that they kind of are the exact opposite of each other, but in the way that gives one another more power. That if they work together, they could do great things. And then, of course, the both of them also end up having a really cool relationship with Gideon, who was very much a by-the-books warrior guy who wants to do what's best for everybody. And so he kind of ends up being a little bit, everyone kind of like states that he's kind of like the golden retriever. He's the one that's going to get everything done and wants everyone to be okay. And it's actually that relationship that Nissa and Chandra end up having of a friendship with Gideon is what throws a lot of the relationship with Nissa and Chandra for a big loop. So while Magic the Gathering, like I had stated, wasn't super duper completely story driven, that didn't state that they didn't have stories. They had stories, but at that time, prior to how things are currently done, where things are released through chapters and side chapters online, and then you can all get them through an archive. prior to that, they had actually been releasing full novelizations. So obviously, the work had to be done farther in advance than when a story was out, and had to take other things into consideration. So obviously, production standards, all of that stuff, authors having time to actually write. So a lot of things were getting done in that way. And around 2019, Nissa and Chandra's stories converged during War of the Spark. So War of the Spark is very divisive when it comes to Chandra and Nissa, in that there are people who liked it, but there are a lot of people like myself who really didn't, because it was kind of a missed opportunity for letting their storyline and what was building between them kind of culminate to its natural point, and then actually kind of felt very out of character for both of them, and specifically for Chandra. Up until War of the Spark, we had seen Nissa and Chandra having moments where they were butting heads, but then they would eventually get to know each other, and they were each growing, seeing the potential in one another, and kind of learning to lean on each other. And then seeing kind of both the friendship and also the romantic potential sparking between them. At one point, it's actually straight up the meme of, oh, how'd you get yourself a baddie? I did not. This person put me on their shoulder and has carried me this entire time. That's literally Chandra and Nissa. That happened before the meme came out. At one point, there was a storyline where they were doing some issue was happening on Kamigawa, and Chandra had been hurt pretty badly, and Nissa and a Johnny break into a jail that Chandra is being held captive in. They break in, they release her and a few other prisoners that had helped Chandra, and Chandra can't move. And Nissa, instead of using magic, Nissa just straight up grabs Chandra, throws her over her shoulder, and takes off. Honestly, it's quite awe-inspiring. I work out so that I can throw my wife over my shoulder and take off in case something happens, you know? We had situations like that constantly happening between them. At one point, we have everyone needs to settle in, I believe, Ravnica for a little bit of time. So they all kind of like settle in Jace's apartments, and Nissa is feeling very out of sorts. She doesn't like it here in Ravnica. It's not that Ravnica doesn't have nature. They do. It's just Ravnica is very much kind of like Coruscant in Star Wars. It's very much a giant metropolis that is inhabited by so many people, and it's more of like a urban political point because of so many guilds there, that she understood that there was still nature on the plane because she's being the animist, she could feel it, but it was so different than a lot of places that they had been, and at this point she had been very homesick because she hadn't been to Zendikar in a bit. So it just felt very different to be so not in tune directly with nature. And she was having a rough time with that. And so she and Chandra very much have like a connecting point where Chandra's frustrated over things that they're deciding to do and they're not taking her seriously. And she and Nissa very much have a point where they go to the highest building they can get to and just sit and talk for a bit, and then just sit, and are together in the sky. And that's about as close as they're allowed to get in terms of intimacy, because Chandra, being the hothead, doesn't necessarily like intimacy, so she pulls away. But there's constantly moments where they're there for one another and they get very close. So the culmination of that was coming to a head with War of the Spark. War of the Spark was, for lack of a better word, or a better phrase technically, like a civil war between different types of planeswalkers. While we had the Gatewatch as the main characters, they weren't the only planeswalkers around. There were different type of planeswalkers from so many different type of planes. And also, in out of meta, in our world, they also started throwing in influences of, there are certain planeswalkers and certain characters that they had created, they being WotC, had created for the different markets. So specifically, China have their own planeswalkers that we here in North America never really get to see too much of. So War of the Spark actually had planeswalkers from those other countries also engaging with the Gatewatch because they were part of the multiverse. So they were all coming together because a great issue had been done because of Nicol Bolas, one of the big bads, having made a power vacuum type of thing. There's a bunch of things happening. I don't want to get into it. It's a lot. But a lot of stuff was happening for War of the Spark. And that, because it was like a big convergence of stories, like I said, going back to mentioning how the stories were done, there were multiple books that were released for War of the Spark. And November 5th of 2019 was very infamous for that. We had War of the Spark Forsaken release. It was a book written by Greg Weisman and was not well received. So in the book, again, we have all of the planeswalkers kind of converging and dealing with all of this great war that was happening. We had all of the planeswalkers from the various multiverses coming together to kind of pick sides, converging, power stuff. It was a whole thing. In this book, we do get perspectives from the various characters. In the book, though, the biggest issue, and honestly one of the hugest red flags, was Chandra and Chandra's characterization, and honestly kind of the lack of taking her characterization to that point realistically and to its forefront that made a lot of people have issues. So while there was a lot of building of the romantic tension between Nissa and Chandra, there was also kind of because it was of its time, in like the 2015, 2017 type of era, where, oh, are we going to let two girls get together? It wasn't as common then, it wasn't as prevalent. There were female characters getting together in various media, but it wasn't the biggest thing at that point yet. So they had, because of the relationship both Chandra and Nissa had with Gideon, there was also lightly sprinklings of, well, could one of them end up with Gideon? Of course, we have to do the love triangle. But there was more emotional stake being put into the development of Nissa and Chandra that it was almost odd to ignore that had been built upon throughout the various stories we saw of the Gatewatch working together. So in Forsaken, it was written that Chandra not only kind of throws that out the window with a single sentence, but also throws out the fact that she is any type of queer, any type of remote feelings that she could have had towards Nissa or any other characters, as we have seen her have very feelings about seeing different types of women around her. She states the phrase, I will put it here on screen, it's very weird. Effectively, she states, no, I'm very much only into men, specifically Gideon. And it completely threw out all of the development of Chandra and Nissa's relationship to that point. And then that happened. And then in the greater overall story of War of the Spark, they also then end up killing Gideon. So not only did they end up completely nuking the love triangle, they also completely bombarded and destroyed the potential for Nissa and Chandra with the single misunderstanding of a writer for the development of a character to that point. At a certain point, Greg Weisman did have to come out and state an apology about the story, and it at one point, one person very recently called it a cursed tome, and honestly, kind of, yeah. At that point, for a while, we don't see Chandra's queerness touched ever for a bit of time. It's just kind of left there in the smoldering pile, dealing with the aftermath and the ramifications of what happened in War of the Spark Forsaken. Because in Greater War of the Spark, like I said, Gideon ends up dying because of something that Liliana did. Liliana, again, not getting into it, but Liliana lies to the Gatewatch to have them come to her aid. And a lot of things end up happening, and Gideon, being the person that he is, takes the literal bullet for Liliana and protects everybody, but dies in the process. And everyone's just aghast at this. Everyone leaves. The Gatewatch effectively is fractured and shattered almost. It probably likely is the original 5 Gatewatch members. One of them's just dust to the wind now. No one wants to talk to each other. And Nissa is absolutely livid over the fact that Chandra is willing to give Liliana a chance, is willing to listen to Liliana about everything that happened. And Nissa came to Liliana's aid at Chandra's behest. And then this happened, and they find out that she had lied to them. And so Nissa leaves. And at that point, Chandra and Nissa have had that fight, and they had that falling out. On top of then, the story also kind of throwing out Chandra's feelings for Nissa and Chandra's queerness. And then we don't handle it for a couple of years. Flash forward to nearly, almost exactly 2 years later. 2 years by a few more days. In November of 2021, Wizards of the Coast has a wonderful writer, K. Arsenault Rivera, write the current 2 sets at that point. Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Innistrad Crimson Vow. Midnight Hunt is on, just like it says, on Innistrad. Innistrad is kind of very much like the Hollywood version of Transylvania. So vampires, werewolves, ghosts, zombies, every creepy crawly thing you can think of in terms of like a horror movie and monster movie is on this plane. And the humans of this plane have to kind of deal with it and try to survive. There's also angels. So it's like gothic horror, the plane. And Innistrad deals with a focus on the werewolves in Midnight Hunt. And then in Crimson Vow, it deals with the perspective of the vampires. And this was written by one author. So this 2-set block, which is something that doesn't necessarily happen too often. A 2-set block is when 2 different sets and 2 storylines happen on one plane. Innistrad having a 2-set storyline was very important at this point because it was about the power struggle and the differences between what was happening with the werewolves and then what was happening with the vampires and how each affected the other. In Midnight Hunt, we got the introduction to Arlen, or one of the introductions to Arlen, and we saw Arlen Cords struggle to kind of be a pack leader while also being a planeswalker and being a werewolf and truly just being mommy. Like, let's be honest. Crimson Vow, we ended up having a storyline where we saw Olivia, who is a vampire, kind of start making moves to try and gaslight gatekeep girl boss her way to the top of the vampire families to forcibly insert herself into a marriage with somebody that she was mind controlling. To then be able to change the status quo. So we see Chandra show up to be able to try and help Arlen prevent that from happening, because the vampire and werewolf relations are tense as it is, and then the moment that you get someone like Olivia more in power, things are not going to be great. So we see Chandra showing up to help Arlen with that. While the Gatewatch themselves are still licking their wounds and more or less fractured, or the original members are fractured, Chandra still has that huge want to be good and help people and also avoid her feelings. So she's going to go to places that will let her help people and avoid the greater thoughts of bad things that had just happened. And it's in this story that we finally see another acknowledgement. Finally, after 2 years of Chandra's queerness. Chandra is seen, it's not a big deal, but it is very important. We end up seeing Chandra making out in the forest with a Cathar named Adeline. Cathars are a specific type of warrior for Innistrad, and it was the first time that we had reapproached that Chandra isn't straight, despite what was stated in War of the Spark Forsaken. This is very important. The writing that was done to show that sprinkling of, no, you didn't imagine it. No, we're never not acknowledging it. Chandra's queer. Here's her making out with a woman. And then we come up to 2023 and we have Wizards of the Coast continuing their relationship, working with Kay Arsenault Rivera as she writes March of the Machine. Before I can start actually appropriately talking about what went down in March of the Machine, we have to do a little bit of a groundwork laying first. So throughout all of the stories with the Gatewatch, we do see little bits and pieces of things that are happening in other planes in the background. Stuff that's kind of culminating slowly to different things. But we see some beings called the Phyrexians kind of start slowly sowing more and more influence throughout the multiverse. This is because of a whole situation with Karn, and Karn dripping, just very weird, but Karn dripping effectively a living oil that is able to influence an individual, and he drops it on a plane of Mirrodin. And then we start seeing the slow percussion and growing influence of Phyrexians in the backgrounds of different stories. Different things start happening. We start seeing it as an audience. But the greater planes and the characters that we follow haven't really seen all of that happen yet. So all of this is happening in the background of the various other stories that are happening. We as an audience know that something is building that the main characters aren't fully cognizant of. It isn't until we get to the set Dominaria United that things finally start coming fully to a head. We've seen sprinklings of things more abruptly in Kamigawa, and also in Kaldheim, and then in New Capenna. But in Dominaria United, we're faced with, we as in the audience and the characters, in the characters' perspectives, are faced with the fact that the Phyrexians are fully a threat and they are already here. We can't just wait. They are here and it is a big deal. In Dominaria United, it takes place on the plane of Dominaria, which is a long, sordid, very huge plane in and of itself. A lot of big, bombastic, old lore storylines from Magic the Gathering happen on Dominaria. But for our instance, Dominaria is where a lot of things come together, and we are faced with the fact that the Phyrexians are back on Dominaria because that is where the initial corrupting influence oil that Karn spilt on Mirrodin was initially created. So now, Dominaria and friends of Dominaria, the planeswalkers who come to Dominaria, have to deal with the fact that there are Phyrexians here portraying themselves as normal people who don't want to murder and convert people to their robot cult. And we are forced and shocked to see that one of the Gatewatch members, not the original Gatewatch, but one of the Gatewatch members for like Gatewatch Unlimited, Gatewatch West, if you would, a Johnny, has been corrupted by, we find out later, another, not necessarily a Gatewatch member, but she was a huge ally. He was corrupted by Tomio, who was also herself corrupted on a situation that happened on Kamigawa. So now, a Johnny, having been corrupted, betrays everyone to help the Phyrexians on Dominaria, and in doing so, he kills Jaya, who is Chandra's mentor. She was the one who helped Chandra really get a handle on her powers after she initially sparked, and while she had some hold of her firepower, she was still very hot-headed, very brash, very young, and Jaya, having been a planeswalker and a fire user herself for so much of her life, because Jaya was an older woman, was a very big influence on Chandra. And Ajani, who was very close friends with Chandra's family, now is corrupted, kills Jaya. And that starts a lot of things from Dominaria and for the Phyrexian situation. The next set, the Brothers' War. And this is kind of where a lot of people start losing some storyline, some key storyline things. Because the Brothers' War, we are told as an audience, as Magic Gathering players, that the Brothers' War is kind of a flashback to all of the things that happened on Dominaria centuries ago between two brothers who truly had too much influence than they ever should have had, but they were the litmus and the reason for so much fracturing and so much of the really, really bad things and bombastic things that happened on Dominaria was because of these two warring brothers. So the Brothers' War main storyline is kind of about seeing Teferi, another friend and ally of the Gatewatch, and I believe he is a Gatewatch member. I believe he's also part of Gatewatch East. He is time traveling to try and figure out through different points of the initial Brother War in Dominaria when they use a specific item so that himself and his friends in the present time could rebuild that item to be able to use it to defeat the Phyrexians. So that's the main storyline that's happening in the Dominaria, or in the Brothers' War set. But what people didn't realize, because Dominaria side stories for Brothers' War were actually set in the present. And that's where a lot of people lost a lot of context that was very important for what was going to happen in Phyrexia All Will Be One, the following set, and then after, in our pivotal set for our queer story here, March of the Machine. So on the Dominaria side of things in the present day, on the side stories for Brothers' War, we see vignettes of the different planeswalkers fighting, and we had at this point seen that multiple planeswalkers have arrived on Dominaria, haven't gotten word that a Johnny has been converted, that Tamio converted him, that so many things are happening and that Dominaria is in need. So Nissa arrives to help, and Nissa and Chandra haven't talked to each other in a bit because of the situation that happened in Brothers' War. Not even the weird Greg Weissman stuff, but specifically the fact that they were arguing over whether or not they can trust Liliana. And they're both on Dominaria. They both fight about that again. And Nissa is very, very put off by all of this. And Nissa tries to do her best on Dominaria to help the plane, being an animist, being able to contact and get in tune with nature and feel that the plane of Dominaria is suffering with the Phyrexian influence. And she tries her best. She's got a very cool story where she tries and tries and tries to get in touch with the world soul of Dominaria, and she's able to speak to it, but it's suffering so much she can't do much of anything to help it. And it kind of rebuffs her help, because the last time that something that was other from Dominaria tried to speak to it, all of this pain and corruption began. So Nissa feels all of this very much, and it's another thing for her to be frustrated about with the Chandra thing, and Chandra not understanding her point of view, and Chandra not being willing to go to bat for her and her feelings like she was for Liliana. And also, she's still missing Gideon as well. So it's a whole big kerfuffle of a thing. And then we see that leads into Jace stating that they need to take the fight to the Phyrexians. They can no longer keep being reactive. They need to go and boom, boom, boom. I want you in my room. This, as a lot of people kind of pointed out, this is kind of Jace trying to puff up and be and act in a way that he believed Gideon would have. Because Gideon, having been the soldier boy, Gideon was more of the planner for attacks. He was more of the one who knew when to make big swings like this and when to kind of rally the troops. And Jace was more of the wizard, more of like, he looked at information, he gathered a lot of arcana, and he got the magic side of things together. This more trickier, stealthier magic side of things together. He wasn't the big bombastic planner guy, but he was trying to be, because he also misses Gideon. And he decides that he's going to get a strike team together of a bunch of different planeswalkers to take the war to Phyrexia. And Nissa ends up being one of them. 10 different planeswalkers, 9 of which who are transported to go to Phyrexia. And everyone's kind of having a meeting before they're able to go to Phyrexia, or what was once Mirrodin. And Chandra's not there. Nissa, having had this confrontation with the world soul on Dominaria and not being able to help, another thing that she's not able to do, and now realizing that she's going to go to what could be a very bad thing for her, wants to actually talk to Chandra. Since the last time they spoke on Dominaria, they did just fight. And she wants to say something to her, anything to her, before going on what could likely be a suicide mission. And Chandra's gone. Because, as someone else tells her, that she, Chandra, left to go to Kaladesh to say something, to at least say goodbye to her mother, or to see if her mother was okay with everything that was happening now that the Phyrexians are making big moves. And Nissa misses her chance to talk to Chandra, to not just be angry with Chandra, to try and get that intimate connection again before she goes off on this mission. And she leaves with the rest of the Planeswalkers. And that leads us into Phyrexia All Will Be One. And Phyrexia All Will Be One is truly, things are bad, you guys. Everything that could go wrong does go wrong. Half of the strike force is almost kind of decimated. They are completed. Completion by the Phyrexians is effectively like becoming part of the Borg on Star Trek. You are no longer you are no longer of your right mind. You, if you remember anything, can remember what your body was forced to do for the greater collective. And Elish Norn, the head leader of everything with the Phyrexians, self-appointed, by the way, she has corrupted these planeswalkers, Nissa, Jace, Vraska, Nahiri, and Luca, to use them as her pawns to spread Phyrexia's will to the rest of the multiverse, using their abilities to planeswalk to make them go to their home planes or wherever she chooses to corrupt and spread more of the Phyrexian oil. And then that leads us directly to March of the Machine, where again, we have Kay Arsenal Rivera, who had written Innistrad, Midnight Hunt, and Crimson Vow, had finally approached the topic very generally of Chandra's queerness again, since that issue back in 2019. We have this author, a queer woman of color, writing March of the Machine, more of a culmination of the missed potential and the terror that is happening amongst the multiverse. I remember when my wife and I realized that Kay was writing this, we both were like, that's interesting, right? That this person who wrote Midnight Hunt Crimson Vow is back? Curiouser and curiouser. And all throughout March, we see a focus on different characters, but really the main focus in this story is Chandra and Chandra's drive to get to Phyrexia and get to how Elish Norn is having all of her troops get to different planes in the multiverse. There's a giant world tree that they have stolen from Kaldheim, which is kind of like the Viking Asgard plane. They have stolen the world tree from Asgard, effectively, and have planted it here in Mirrodin, in Phyrexia, and have corrupted it, and are using its ways to connect different areas, to connect it to different parts of the multiverse, to start spreading the corruption, while using the completed planeswalkers to lead factions onto these different planes, to cause chaos everywhere. And Nissa has been completed, and Chandra is told this by Kaya and a few of the other survivors who are able to leave Phyrexia and get back to Dominaria and tell them, y'all, things went bad. And Chandra's instant response is that she needs to go to Phyrexia. She needs to get to Nissa. She needs to stop this because she wasn't able to talk to Nissa. If it happened to Nissa, this is very bad. Nissa was very powerful. Nissa knew what to do. Nissa watched everything. And Chandra needed to get to her to stop this. And no one sided with Chandra. Everyone just thought that Chandra was being Chandra and over emotional, and there can be a lot to be read into that Chandra is not neurotypical. So people kind of like write off Chandra. She knows that everyone is struggling, and she knows that these people just came back from this very bad thing that they all dealt with, and she knows that everyone's worried about their planes. All she can think is, how do I get to the center of it? Because if I can stop the center of it, I save everyone. And by saving everyone, I also save Nissa. And we see Chandra find a single ally, a single wonderful ally in another planeswalker who's also relatively young, the Dryad, Ren, and her tree companion, Seven. And they both kind of partner up, and they're like, yeah, we're going to go do this thing. You're right. If we can get to that world tree and we can burn it to the ground, or me as a Dryad, thinks Ren, confused with it, I can stop its corruption and I can pull it from these planes. And so they take off to Phyrexia, and it's its own bundle of worms dealing with that. And the Nissa is there, completely overseeing the world tree in her corrupted form. And Chandra is faced with so many memories of missed opportunities and how they were both so dumb in avoiding speaking with one another, and how she avoided talking to Nissa, not just about what happened during War of the Spark, but so many times when she pulled away from her and she shouldn't have. And she blames herself for that, and how dumb it was that they stopped talking when they were so important to one another. And I'm like, wow, this is real queer, guys. And we start seeing the chaos happening around them, and through the various things that happen in that story, they're able, with a lot of struggle, to get the world tree on Phyrexia to pull away. And Ren sacrifices her life to be able to bring Teferi and his people from Zhalfir to Mirrodin in New Phyrexia, and they are able to, with the help of Elspeth and her new angelic form, able to fight off Elesh Norn and the Phyrexians. And they turn the tide of battle, and throughout it all, Chandra's struggling to fight Nissa without actually hurting Nissa. And they're able to knock her out, and her and Ajani are both brought to Zhalfir now that the battle is done and they've defeated Elesh Norn. And there's a last-ditch effort to try and save them from their corruption. And they do it, and it takes a lot, and there's a lot of struggle. But we see a sacrifice that is given, multiple sacrifices that are given to uncomplete Nissa and Ajani. And it works. And the first thing out of Nissa's mouth is confirming that it's Chandra who she's seeing when she opens her eyes. And they kiss. And the world lost its mind because everyone was so excited that Chandra and Nissa were finally getting to acknowledge their emotional and romantic relationship for one another. That tie that they had had, the lead up that they had had, was still there, despite it all, maybe even because of it all. And that was something that was entrusted by Wizards of the Coast to a queer author. And that was huge. It was great. It was amazing. And I, no matter how you felt about how March of the Machine ended, you had to address the fact that there was a lot of maturity written in having a story that could have just been death, death, death. Death is the end consequence to everything. End up being instead about how emotional ties and emotional consequences really can drive and destroy people. And we're seeing that here with Chandra pushing herself to exhaustion to get here. Ren giving up her life to be able to give them a chance. Everyone doing everything to get to these points because of choices that they all made, decisions that they all made. Even Nissa being completed, while it was frustrating to a lot of people because Nissa had not been used narratively in a story for a long time. And then here she was, and she got an L, and she got another L, and then she got completed and got an ultimate L. But here we see the culmination of her decisions and everything that led her here. And she's finally able to have this reconnection with somebody who she had a pretty deep connection with before. The last story that we have just seen is March of the Machine Aftermath. It only had 2 side stories, and they're up in the air. Now we are seeing that as an aftermath of everything that had happened in March, we are seeing that a lot of different planeswalkers have lost their spark. They've lost their ability to planeswalk. They are stuck on whatever plane that they're on. We don't have a confirmation of exactly how many planeswalkers have lost their spark. We know that Nissa has. So one of the side stories, there was only 2, like I said, one of the side stories is from Nissa's perspective. And it's very interesting because we see Nissa struggling with the fact that she is now on Zhalfir with surviving Mirrodins who don't blame her for what she did while she was corrupted and completed, but she blames herself. She can't sit here and just be around these people who she did so many bad things to. And so she's struggling with that, and she's struggling trying to have really this open, emotional, and intimate relationship and contact and communication with Chandra, and Chandra continues to pull away. Chandra continues to chase after being the big damn hero and leaves Nissa to go find a Johnny, because a Johnny, having been uncompleted and told what he did to the multiverse, he leaves, having weirdly been one of the only planeswalkers that didn't lose his spark. Chandra also hadn't lost her spark, so that's why she went after a Johnny. But Nissa is just frustrated that Chandra said she would never leave her again, and then she did pretty quickly after the fact, in fact. And so this story deals with Nissa dealing with that, and Nissa trying to find a new purpose in life, because also as a planeswalker, your magic becomes very tied with your spark. And being an animist, her whole thing is being able to speak with nature and to attune to nature and use the magic and the life force within nature as her own, and to control it and to be a voice for nature. And she can't speak to the world soul on this newfound plane of Zhalfir. She can't get in contact with it. She can't get in contact with trees. She can't do anything. She can hardly use her magic as it is. And she's struggling. She's left afloat and akimbo. And then a situation happens where she and Teferi and Koth, another planeswalker, all 3 of them having lost their sparks, have to deal with having found an omen path, a tear in the plane, a kind of portal that connects to different things. They find this, or Nissa finds it, and then all of them have to deal with the fact that a beast bursts forth from it, and they have to try and fight it, and they can't. And then Chandra shows back up, and through a bunch of actions of all of them trying to fight and control this creature, Nissa loses it. And Nissa tells Chandra everything. How she's feeling now, how she feels lost, how she doesn't know if Chandra even actually cares about her because she tells her one thing and then leaves. And how everything that happened in March previously was just Chandra going out of her way to save her and not seeing Nissa as a person anymore after everything that just happened. And now Nissa has even lost her spark. So is she even important and worth it? And Chandra's forced to face the fact that she continues to run away from intimate conversations and from close ties like that, and ended up hurting one of the most important people to her. And so through that story, they are able to come together, and they do talk about the fact they finally sit down and actually talk to one another and use what magic Nissa has to work cooperatively, using both of their magics to help this creature that is also lost and adrift and was also in pain like Nissa. And they release it because it was forced into another form, having been changed from one form to another, having crossed through this portal into a different plane than its own. And Nissa and Chandra actively make the decision together to be together for one another, not because of one another. They are choosing to continue being together and actively have started a relationship now. We see Chandra having been, it's kind of tossed up if Chandra is bisexual or pansexual. I choose to believe she's pansexual, so I believe pansexuality is where we're going with Chandra. And Nissa, I believe, was more of a lesbian. But again, we did get that forced, like, will they, won't they love triangle thing between her, Chandra, and Gideon, which I read, especially with Greg Reisman's writing, I read more as compulsory heterosexuality, which effectively is comphet, if you've ever seen that. It is effectively when a person of a differing sexuality is forced or believes that it would be better to ignore their feelings to go what is better by the belief of the greater society, which typically is heterosexuality. So I believe Nissa to actually be a lesbian, but with comphet pushed upon her. But nevertheless, that is where we end up with these two lovely queers. Their long and sordid history has led to them finally being together, allowed to be together. Their status quo turned upside down, and the two of them join hands and walk into that omen path that just opened on Zalfir. And we don't know where they're going. They could be anywhere. And I'm sure we'll figure that out soon. But that's where we leave them now. Their long struggle and years in the making to finally get together. And I think it's fascinating to really kind of lay out their history there, as broad strokes as that is, because that's kind of really important to the development of magic. Through Nissa and Chandra's relationship, we see kind of the evolution of what's important in Wizards history and how they treat the writing of different characters. And that's why I thought they would be super important and super great to have as kind of the pilot episode for showing and highlighting queer couples and queer characters in general in Magic the Gathering. But that's everything. Oh, also, I did actually get Kay Rivera to actually sign the back of Chandra, also the back of Nissa, because she did so much heavy lifting to get them both here and themselves and get their characterization more depth to kind of write the lost potential that happened during War of the Spark. And it's truly a great gift. When it happened, when the initial stuff happened in March, so many people were like, Happy Pride! So I figured they were the perfect story to go with here. But as I go along with the rest of the queer characters, it's not going to be necessarily as in-depth as this, because as kind of like the characters who come up most in the thought process of the gay characters in Magic the Gathering, Chandra and Nissa, especially having been part of the Gatewatch and part of the main characters in Magic, have a lot of story to them and have a lot of history to them. But there are still a lot of other queer characters who have some as well. So the other episodes are going to be highlights of different characters, and then I will talk on couples, because typically couples tend to have a little bit more story when you put them together. But that has been this, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please do the thing, like, comment, share. I want to know, who's your favorite of the queer characters in Magic the Gathering? There are actually quite a few. So every Friday after this release, I will be, through the month of June, releasing new character episodes on the queer characters of Magic the Gathering. It's going to be great, y'all, and I can't wait to talk about the Pride in the Multiverse.